It wasn't a race, it was a massacre. In February 1964, the air at the Daytona International Speedway changed. It didn't smell like burning rubber or high-octane fuel, it smelled like fear. The four teams who had spent millions of dollars developing their 427 engines stood on the pit wall and watched something that defied physics. They watched Richard Petty's Plymouth Belvedere, a car that looked exactly like the one your dentist drove, tear a hole in the atmosphere so violent that the other cars seemed to be moving in reverse. This wasn't just a fast car, this was an extinction event. The engine under that hood, the legendary 426 Hemi, was so dominant, so mechanically unfair that it didn't just break the track record, it broke the psychological will of the entire paddock. It was an engine so advanced that Ford, the largest automaker in the world, looked at it and said, "We can't beat that, we quit." And they meant it. This is the story of the only engine in NASCAR history that was banned not because it cheated, but because it worked too well. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the mechanical secrets that racing organizations try to bury. If you're someone who loves seeing engineering brilliance get outlawed by a panicked rulebook, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. To understand why the 426 Hemi was such a crisis, you have to understand the world it was born into. The year is 1963. NASCAR isn't the slick corporate billboard it is today. It's gritty, it's dangerous, and most importantly, it's stock. The rulebook was built on a very simple promise. The car on the track had to be related to the car in the showroom. This was the era of win on Sunday, sell on Monday. It wasn't just a marketing slogan, it was a literal business model. If a Ford Galaxy won the Daytona 500, Ford dealerships across the country would have lines out the door on Monday morning. The manufacturers knew this. They were pouring millions into their racing programs because racing was the only advertising that actually mattered. But there was a problem. A big one. Chrysler was getting their teeth kicked in. Ford had the 427. Chevrolet, even though they were officially banned from racing, was sliding high-performance 409 and 427 mystery motors out the back door to teams like Smokey Yunick. Chrysler was running the 413 and 426 Max Wedge. Now look, the Max Wedge was a good engine. It was a great drag racing engine, but on the super speedways where you have to hold the throttle wide open for 500 miles, the Wedge design had a fatal flaw. It couldn't breathe. At 7,000 RPM, a Wedge engine is gasping for air. The valves are shrouded. The air has to make a sharp turn to get into the cylinder. It's like trying to run a marathon while breathing through a coffee stirrer. You can do it, but you're not going to win. Chrysler's engineers were desperate. They needed 50 more horsepower to catch Ford, but they had hit the physical limit of the Wedge design. They didn't need a tweak, they needed a miracle. So they did something that corporate accountants hate. They went into the basement, blew the dust off some blueprints from the 1950s, and resurrected a concept that everyone else had abandoned: the hemispherical combustion chamber. Now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal about a round combustion chamber? Imagine a tennis ball cut in half. That's the shape of a Hemi chamber. Because it's a round dome, you can put the valves on opposite sides of the head. In a Wedge engine, like a Ford or Chevy, the valves are side by side, fighting for space. In a Hemi, the valves are massive and they open directly into the center of the cylinder. The intake charge falls straight in. There are no corners, there is no restriction. If the Wedge engine breathes through a straw, the Hemi breathes through a sewer pipe. But building this engine for 1964 was a Manhattan Project level secret. Chrysler knew that if NASCAR found out what they were doing, they might ban it before it even hit the track. They cast the blocks with extra iron. They designed cross-bolted main caps, meaning the crankshaft was held in place not just from the bottom, but from the sides, through the skirt of the block. This is diesel truck technology applied to a race car. It made the bottom end virtually indestructible. You could detonate a grenade inside a 426 Hemi block and it would probably just ask for more fuel. And then there was the lie, the most famous lie in automotive history. When Chrysler released the specs for the 426 Hemi, they rated it at 425 horsepower. This number was a joke. It was political fiction. They picked 425 because it was just slightly more than Ford's 410, but not enough to scare the insurance companies or the sanctioning body. The reality? On the dyno, in race trim, with a pair of massive Carter AFB carburetors sucking 800 cubic feet of air per minute, the 426 Hemi was making closer to 550 horsepower. Some tuners saw 580. That is a 150 horsepower lie. In a sport where people kill for 5 horsepower, 150 is not an advantage, it's a cheat code. When the teams arrived at Daytona in February 1964, the sound gave it away first. A wedge engine has a specific roar, but the Hemi sounded different. Because of those massive exhaust valves and the perfect flow, it had a sharper, deeper crack. It sounded violent. It sounded expensive. And when Richard Petty took his Plymouth out for qualifying, the stopwatch confirmed everyone's worst nightmare: 174.418 miles per hour. He didn't just break the track record, he shattered it by miles per hour. Here's what most people don't realize about that 1964 Daytona 500. It wasn't just that the Hemi was fast, it was that it was effortless. The Ford drivers were white-knuckling their cars, pushing their engines to the ragged edge of explosion just to run 168 miles per hour. The Chrysler drivers were practically cruising at 174. Paul Goldsmith, driving a Plymouth, put it on pole. Richard Petty was right there. When the race started, the Hemi cars didn't race the Fords, they raced each other. They formed a train at the front of the pack and simply drove away. By lap 50, the Fords were lapped traffic. They were mobile chicanes. The result was humiliating. Richard Petty led 184 of the 200 laps. Plymouths and Dodges finished 1, 2, 3, 4. The first Ford was miles behind, choking on exhaust fumes. It was the most lopsided victory in the history of the sport. And in the garages, the mood shifted from shock to anger. Ford wasn't just beaten, they were embarrassed. They had spent millions and they had been made to look like amateurs by an engine that looked like it belonged in a semi-truck. This is where it gets really interesting. NASCAR, led by the iron-fisted Bill France Sr., had a massive problem. France didn't care about engineering purity, he cared about selling tickets. And nobody buys tickets to watch a parade. If Chrysler won every race by 3 laps, the fans would stop coming. But more importantly, Ford was threatening to walk. Henry Ford II was not a man who liked losing. He sent word to Bill France: "Fix this or we're gone." Ford was providing a huge chunk of the marketing money that kept NASCAR alive. If Ford pulled out, the sport might collapse. So Bill France looked at the 426 Hemi. He looked at the rulebook, and he decided that if he couldn't beat the engine on the track, he would beat it in the boardroom. He didn't just want to slow the Hemi down, he wanted to exile it. But he couldn't just say the Hemi is banned because it's too fast. That would make Chrysler look like martyrs. No, he needed a loophole. He needed a technicality. He needed to change the definition of what a car actually was. And that is exactly what he did. Bill France didn't just rewrite the rulebook, he weaponized it. In late 1964, NASCAR announced new regulations for the 1965 season that were so specifically targeted, they might as well have been named the Anti-Chrysler Act. The new rules centered on a word that would become the bane of every manufacturer's existence: homologation. Before 1965, stock meant the parts were available over the counter. You could buy a 426 Hemi engine in a crate, put it in your race car, and go fast. It was a production engine in the sense that they produced it, but it wasn't exactly sitting in your grandmother's station wagon. France changed the definition. He decreed that for an engine to be legal in grand national competition, it couldn't just be a special order part. It had to be a regular production option installed in a minimum number of street cars available to the general public. Now, here's the trap. The number he picked wasn't random. He set the production requirement high enough that a specialized race engine like the Hemi, which cost a fortune to build and was a nightmare to drive in traffic, could never meet it. He effectively said, if you want to race this engine, you have to sell thousands of them to normal people. He knew Chrysler couldn't do it. The Hemi was a race engine. It had solid lifters, it had massive clearances, it fouled spark plugs if it idled for more than 30 seconds. It wasn't designed for grocery runs, it was designed for 180 miles per hour. Selling thousands of them to the public wasn't just a logistical nightmare, it was a warranty disaster waiting to happen. Chrysler read the new rules and saw the writing on the wall. They realized that Bill France wasn't trying to level the playing field, he was trying to evict them from the stadium. So they did something that nobody expected. They didn't beg, they didn't try to cheat, they simply packed their bags. In a press release that hit the racing world like a bomb, Chrysler announced they were withdrawing from NASCAR immediately. "If we can't run the Hemi," they effectively said, "we won't run at all." The 1965 season opened to a ghost town. The Daytona 500, usually the biggest spectacle in motorsport, felt like a funeral. The mighty Plymouths and Dodges were gone. Richard Petty, the king, the defending champion, was sitting at home in Level Cross, North Carolina. The fans arrived at the track expecting a heavyweight title fight and instead got a Ford parade. With no competition, the Fords just circled the track. The excitement evaporated. Attendance plummeted. It was a disaster for NASCAR. Bill France had gotten what he wanted, the Hemi was gone, but he had killed the show in the process. Here's the thing. Richard Petty wasn't the kind of guy who could just sit on his couch. He was a racer. If he couldn't turn left, he'd go straight. With NASCAR closed to him, Petty decided to go drag racing. He built a 1965 Plymouth Barracuda, painted it Petty blue, and dropped a 426 Hemi in it. He called it 43 Junior. The drag racing world went crazy. The king of NASCAR was coming to their playground. But this move had tragic consequences. Drag racing is a different beast. The cars are lighter, the power is more violent, and the safety standards in 1965 were primitive. In Dallas, Georgia, tragedy struck. A piece of the car's suspension broke during a run. The Barracuda veered into the crowd. A young boy was killed. It was a dark moment that haunted Petty for the rest of his life. It was the brutal, unintended cost of the NASCAR boycott. The political war between a corporation and a sanctioning body had spilled over into real life with devastating results. The Hemi was exiled, Petty was grieving, and the sport was broken. Meanwhile, back at the NASCAR tracks, the Fords were winning everything, but nobody cared. A race without a villain isn't a race, it's a commute. Ford, interestingly, had seen the Hemi threat coming and had developed their own nuclear option, the 427 SOHC Cammer. This was an overhead cam monster designed to out-rev the Hemi, but when France banned the Hemi, he banned the Cammer too, calling it a special racing engine. Ford was furious. They had spent millions developing an engine to fight a ghost. The entire 1965 season was a wash of wasted money and angry executives. By the summer of 1965, Bill France was sweating. The grandstands were empty. The promoters were screaming. He realized he had overplayed his hand. He needed Chrysler back. He needed the Hemi. But Bill France was a dictator. He couldn't admit he was wrong. So a compromise was hatched. A deal was made in a smoke-filled room that would change the automotive landscape forever. France told Chrysler, "Okay, you can run the Hemi, but you have to follow the rules. You have to put it in a streetcar, a real streetcar, and you have to sell it to anyone who walks in with cash." This brings us to the birth of the legend. To get back into NASCAR, Chrysler had to civilize the beast. They took the 426 race Hemi and detuned it, slightly. They lowered the compression ratio from 12.5 to 1 to 10.25 to 1 so it could run on pump gas. They swapped the magnesium intake for aluminum. They added choke towers to the carburetors so it would start on a cold morning. They put cast iron exhaust manifolds on it instead of headers. But here's what most people don't realize. Inside the block, it was still a race engine. It still had the forged crank. It still had the massive rods. It still had the giant valves. They called it the Street Hemi. It debuted in 1966. You could walk into a Dodge dealer, check a box on the order form for a Coronet or a Charger, pay an extra $800, which was a fortune back then, about 25% of the car's price, and drive home with a detuned NASCAR engine. It was unruly, it was heavy, it got 6 miles to the gallon, it overheated in traffic, and if you weren't careful in the rain, it would kill you. But it was legal. Chrysler had met the homologation requirement. They built enough of them to satisfy Bill France, and in doing so, they unleashed the most legendary muscle car engine of all time. The return of the Hemi in 1966 was supposed to be the end of the story. The king was back. The engine was legal. The fans returned. But Bill France wasn't done. He had let the Hemi back in, but he hadn't promised it would be a fair fight. He still believed the engine was fundamentally unfair, so he opened up a new page in the rulebook, a page titled Weight Penalties. If he couldn't ban the Hemi, he would make it carry an anchor. This is where the secret math comes in. The 1966 rule stated that Hemi cars had to carry significantly more weight than the Ford and GM wedge cars. We're talking hundreds of pounds. Imagine running a sprint race with a backpack full of bricks. That was the Hemi's reality. France created a sliding scale of displacement to weight ratios designed specifically to neutralize the Hemi's airflow advantage. He wanted to make sure that even with 550 horsepower, the Chrysler cars couldn't accelerate out of the corners faster than the Fords. The mechanics at the Chrysler teams, guys like Maurice Petty, Richard's brother and engine builder, looked at these new weight rules and laughed. Not a happy laugh, but a "you've got to be kidding me" laugh. They realized that to be competitive, they would have to abuse the tires. A heavier car shreds rubber faster, it uses more brakes, it burns more fuel. The Hemi advantage was being eroded by physics. But they also knew something Bill France didn't. They knew that the Hemi loved load. The torque curve of that engine was so flat, so massive, that it didn't care about the extra weight as much as a wedge engine would. You could load a Hemi down and it would just grunt and pull harder. The 1966 Daytona 500 became the testing ground for this new penalized reality. Richard Petty was back in the number 43 Plymouth. The car was heavy. The engine was legal. The Fords were waiting. And when the green flag dropped, everyone held their breath to see if the king could reclaim his crown with an anchor tied to his bumper. What happened next proved that you can legislate weight, but you can't legislate engineering superiority. The 1966 Daytona 500 was supposed to be the funeral for the Hemi's dominance. With the extra weight, the Petty Blue Plymouth was dragging an anchor. But Richard Petty didn't drive it like a heavy car. He drove it like he was mad at it. When the race started, the Fords tried to swarm him. They thought the extra weight would kill his tires. They thought his brakes would fade. But they forgot one critical variable: torque. The 426 Hemi made so much torque that it could pull the extra weight out of the corners without breaking a sweat. Petty didn't just win, he conquered. He led 108 laps. He became the first driver ever to win the Daytona 500 twice. And when the race was over, he climbed out of that heavy, penalized car with a smile that said everything. The message was clear. You can add lead to the car, but you can't add lead to the engine. Here's the thing. This victory didn't solve the problem for Bill France. It made it worse. He had thrown everything in the rulebook at the Hemi: homologation, weight penalties, intake restrictions, and it still won the biggest race of the year. The unfair advantage was still there. So France and his tech inspectors started getting creative. They started looking at carburetors. They started looking at fuel tank sizes. They started looking at the very air the engine breathed. This ushered in the era of the restrictor plate, a concept that haunts NASCAR to this day. They realized that if they couldn't stop the engine from being efficient, they would just choke it to death. But while the NASCAR war was raging, something else was happening on the streets of America. The street Hemi had arrived, and it was creating a legend that would outlive the racing controversy. You have to understand, in 1966, a fast car ran a 14-second quarter mile. A 426 Hemi Charger or Belvedere could run 13s on skinny bias-ply tires. If you put slicks on it, it ran 12s. This was supercar territory. But owning one was a commitment. It wasn't like owning a Mustang. The Hemi was temperamental. It hated traffic. It hated cold weather. It rattled. It shook. It was an engine that wanted to be at 6,000 RPM, and it resented you for driving it to the grocery store. Mechanics hated them. The dual 4-barrel carburetors were a nightmare to tune if you didn't know what you were doing. The solid lifters needed constant adjustment. You had to get under the hood every few weeks with a feeler gauge. It was a high-maintenance relationship. But that was the point. If you owned a Hemi, you were a mechanic. You were part of a secret club. When you pulled into a gas station, which you did often because it got 6 miles per gallon, people stopped what they were doing. The Hemi badge on the fender was a warning label. It said, "I have the same engine that Richard Petty uses to humiliate Ford." Now, you might be thinking, okay, so Chrysler won the engine war. What did Ford do? Well, Ford didn't just sit there. They realized that if they couldn't beat the Hemi on horsepower, they had to beat it on aerodynamics. This brings us to the next phase of the conflict, the Aero Wars. By 1968, the cars were going so fast, pushing 180, 190 miles per hour, that air resistance was becoming a bigger problem than horsepower. The Hemi could push a brick through the air, but it used a lot of fuel to do it. Chrysler had a problem. The 1968 Dodge Charger was a beautiful car. It looked mean, it looked fast, but aerodynamically it was a disaster. The front grille was a giant mouth that trapped air. The rear window was recessed, creating a vacuum that lifted the rear tires off the ground at high speed. When the Dodge drivers hit 180, the car would get light, the steering would get vague. It was terrifying. The Hemi had the power to go 200 miles per hour, but the body wouldn't let it. So the Chrysler engineers went back to the drawing board. They couldn't change the engine. NASCAR had locked that down tight, so they changed the car. They took the Charger and flushed the grille. They filled in the rear window to make the air flow smoothly over the trunk. They called it the Charger 500. It was better, but it wasn't enough. Ford showed up with the Torino Talladega, a car with a sloped nose designed specifically to cheat the wind. The Fords started winning again. The Hemi was still powerful, but the Ford bodies were slippery. This is where it gets really interesting. Chrysler decided to go nuclear. They looked at the rulebook again. The homologation rules said they had to build 500 cars for the public. It didn't say the cars had to be pretty. It didn't say they had to be practical. So they built the Dodge Daytona. They took a Charger, bolted a pointy nose cone on the front, and mounted a massive wing on the trunk. The wing wasn't there for style. It was there to keep the rear tires on the ground. It was so tall because it had to be in clean air above the roofline. When the Dodge Daytona showed up at Talladega in 1969, it was like a spaceship had landed in Alabama. The other teams laughed. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a cartoon. But then Charlie Glotzbach took it out for a practice lap and ran 199.466 miles per hour. The laughter stopped instantly. The Hemi finally had a body that could keep up with it. The combination of the unfair engine and the unfair aerodynamics created the first 200-mile-per-hour stock car. Buddy Baker broke the 200-mile-per-hour barrier in a Daytona later that year. Bill France watched this with horror. He had spent 5 years trying to slow these cars down, and now they were going faster than ever. The Hemi was propelling 3,800-pound winged monsters at speeds that the tires couldn't handle. The tires were literally exploding under the load. The drivers were terrified. The fans loved it, but the insurance companies were threatening to pull the plug. France realized he had lost control of the monster he created. By banning the Hemi initially, he had forced Chrysler to innovate. By penalizing it with weight, he forced them to innovate again. By restricting the intake, he forced them to look at aerodynamics. Every rule he wrote to stop them just made them faster in a different way. The 1970 season brought the Plymouth Superbird, Richard Petty's version of the winged car. Petty had actually defected to Ford for a year in 1969 because Plymouth didn't have a winged car yet. He wanted to win. When Plymouth built the Superbird, they lured the king back. The sight of Richard Petty in that Petty blue Superbird with the 426 Hemi screaming at 7,000 RPM is the defining image of the muscle car era. It was the peak of excess, the peak of speed, and the peak of the war. But wars end, and they usually end because one side runs out of money or the rules change so drastically that fighting becomes impossible. By 1971, the writing was on the wall. The EPA was cracking down on emissions. The insurance companies were jacking up rates for high-performance cars. And Bill France had finally had enough. For the 1971 season, NASCAR announced a new rule that was the final nail in the coffin. They didn't ban the Hemi outright. They didn't ban the winged cars outright. They just did the math. The new rule stated that special cars, meaning the winged cars, could only run an engine smaller than 305 cubic inches. If you wanted to run a 426 Hemi, you had to run a standard body. And even then, the Hemi cars were hit with carburetor restrictor plates that choked them down to the point of irrelevance. It was a soft ban. You could run a Hemi, technically, but you wouldn't win. The restrictor plate took away the one advantage the Hemi had, airflow. Without that massive gulp of air, the Hemi was just a heavy, complicated engine. Chrysler looked at the new rules. They looked at the dying muscle car market. They looked at the millions of dollars it would take to keep fighting, and they decided the war was over. The 426 Hemi program was wound down. The tooling was stored. The engineers moved on to building emissions-compliant engines for station wagons. The era of the elephant was officially over. But here is the irony. The Hemi didn't die. It became a martyr. Because it was banned, because it was legislated out of existence, it achieved a mythical status that no other engine ever reached. The Ford 427 was a great engine, but it wasn't outlawed in the same way. The Chevy 427 was a beast, but it didn't cause a boycott. The Hemi was the bad boy. It was the engine that was too wild for civilization, and that reputation kept it alive in the minds of enthusiasts. In the 1970s and 80s, while the factories were churning out 150 horsepower choked V8s, the legend of the Hemi grew. Old race cars were pulled out of barns. Street Hemis were restored. People started racing them in drag racing classes like Superstock, where they continued to dominate for decades. The NHRA had to create special classes just for Hemi cars, because even 20 years later, nothing else could catch them. Bill France won the battle. He slowed the cars down. He kept NASCAR alive. He made it safe-ish. But he lost the war for the soul of the sport. The fans never forgot the time when a plain white Plymouth showed up and destroyed the world. They never forgot the sound, and they never forgot that for a few glorious years, engineering mattered more than the rulebook. The Hemi was dead in NASCAR. The rulebook had finally choked the life out of it. But here's the thing. You can't ban an engine from a racetrack, but you can't ban it from the American consciousness. In fact, by outlawing the 426, Bill France had inadvertently created the ultimate outlaw symbol. If NASCAR said it was too fast, then every street racer in Detroit, Los Angeles, and Woodward Avenue immediately wanted one. The ban didn't kill the Hemi, it martyred it. It turned a piece of cast iron into a holy relic of speed. When the factory support dried up in 1971, the 426 Hemi didn't just fade away, it migrated. It found a new home where too fast wasn't a crime, it was the whole point. Drag racing. The National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, welcomed the Hemi refugees with open arms. While NASCAR was busy putting restrictor plates on carburetors, drag racers were bolting on blowers and injecting nitromethane. The very architecture that made the Hemi unfair on the oval, the massive ports, the cross-bolted mains, the heavy block, made it the perfect platform for the quarter mile. This is where the legend of Sox and Martin comes in. Ronnie Sox, the Mr. 4-Speed, took the Hemi and did things with it that defied logic. In the Pro Stock class, the very class that Bill Jenkins would later revolutionize with his Vega, the Hemi Cudas and Challengers were the gold standard. They were heavy, yes, but they made so much power that it didn't matter. The sound of the Hemi at 8,500 RPM in the burnout box became the soundtrack of 1970s drag racing. It was a visceral, chest-thumping roar that you could feel in your teeth. And let's talk about the street cars again, because the street Hemi mythos is fascinating. In 1970, if you bought a Hemi Cuda, you weren't buying a top-of-the-line cruiser, you were buying a headache. Seriously, the engine came with a disclaimer. It had no warranty for racing, yet it was clearly built for nothing else. It used dual 4-barrel Carter carburetors that were notoriously difficult to keep synchronized. If you drove it gently, like a normal person, the spark plugs would foul with carbon in about 50 miles. The engine would start to misfire. It would buck and surge. It hated going slow. It was an engine that demanded to be abused. To clear the plugs, you had to find a straight stretch of road and floor it. You had to drive it like you stole it just to keep it running right. This high-maintenance personality is what made it cool. It filtered out the casuals. If you saw a Hemi Cuda at a stoplight, you knew the driver was a mechanic. You knew they had a toolbox in the trunk. You knew they put up with the overheating, the noise, and the abysmal fuel economy because when the light turned green, nothing else on Earth could touch them. It was a badge of honor. You were driving a banned weapon. You were driving the engine that Richard Petty used to humiliate Ford. Now, you might be thinking, why are these cars worth millions today? I mean, a 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible sold for $3.5 million. Why? It's just a car, right? Wrong. It's a piece of history. It represents the absolute peak of the unrestricted era. That car was built right before the government stepped in with emissions laws, right before the insurance companies stepped in with surcharges, and right after NASCAR stepped in with bans. It is a survivor from a war that the car companies lost. When you buy a Hemi car, you aren't buying transportation, you are buying a middle finger to authority. You are buying the physical manifestation of too fast to race. The engineering legacy of the 426 is also unexpected. Most race engines from the 1960s are obsolete today. You wouldn't run a 1964 FE engine in a modern race car. But the Hemi architecture is still the basis for the most powerful engines on the planet. Look at top-fuel dragsters today. They make 11,000 horsepower. They cover the quarter mile in 3 seconds. And if you look at the block design, the head bolt pattern, the valve angles, it is still fundamentally a Chrysler 426 Hemi. It has been billet machined and enlarged, sure, but the DNA is 1964. The engineers at Chrysler got the physics so right on the first time that 60 years later, we still haven't found a better way to make massive horsepower with push rods. This brings us to the elephant nickname. They called it the elephant because it was huge, heavy, and powerful. But elephants also never forget, and neither did the competition. The trauma that the 426 Hemi inflicted on Ford and GM in 1964 shaped their engineering decisions for decades. Ford spent millions developing the Boss 429 specifically to fight the Hemi. Chevy developed the ZL1 aluminum 427 specifically to fight the Hemi. The entire muscle car wars of the late 60s were basically an arms race to see who could build a Hemi killer. The Hemi forced everyone else to get better. It forced the entire industry to innovate. But there is a darker side to this story. The banning of the Hemi set a precedent that haunts NASCAR to this day. It taught the sanctioning body that they could control the show. Before 1964, the rulebook was about safety and displacement. After 1964, the rulebook was about competitive balance. Bill France realized that he didn't have to let the best team win. He could manipulate the rules to ensure a close finish. This philosophy, managing the competition, is why we have restrictor plates today. It's why we have standardized bodies. It's why modern NASCAR race cars are all virtually identical. It all traces back to that moment when a Plymouth won by 3 laps and ruined the show. The 426 Hemi was the last true factory experimental engine allowed to run wild. It was the last time a manufacturer could throw unlimited money in engineering at a problem and put the result directly on the track. After the ban, everything became managed. Everything became homologated. The stock in stock car racing began to die the moment they outlawed the Hemi. Because if you can't run the engine that you actually sell, are you really racing stock cars anymore? This leads us to a fascinating what-if scenario. What if Bill France hadn't banned it? What if he had let the 426 Hemi run unrestricted in 1965? Ford might have quit, sure. Or Ford might have released the 427 SOHC Cammer in thousands of streetcars to meet the rules. Chevy might have unleashed their overhead cam 427s. We might have seen an era of exotic, high-revving overhead cam V8s in American muscle cars in the late 60s. Instead, the ban forced everyone back to pushrods. It forced everyone back to cheaper, simpler designs. By banning the Hemi, NASCAR might have actually stunted American automotive engineering for 20 years. We settled for good enough because great was illegal. And that is the real tragedy of the 426. It wasn't just an engine. It was a glimpse of a future we never got. A future where engineering excellence was rewarded, not punished. A future where the speed limit was determined by physics, not by a rulebook. The Hemi was a traveler from that timeline, and we sent it back because we weren't ready for it. Today, if you go to a car show and you see a hood propped open, look for the massive valve covers. Look for the spark plugs going right into the center of the head. That is the mark of the beast. That is the 426. And if you're lucky, the owner will start it up. And when it idles, that rough, choppy, angry idle that sounds like it wants to fight you, remember that you are listening to the sound of controversy. You are listening to the engine that scared NASCAR to death. But the story doesn't end in the history books, because in 2003, Chrysler brought the name back. They launched the new Hemi. It was a marketing masterstroke. They put it in trucks, they put it in sedans, they put it in Jeeps, and suddenly a new generation of kids knew the word Hemi. But let's be honest, the 5.7-liter Hemi in your Ram truck is a great engine, but it's not the Hemi. It doesn't have the true hemispherical chambers. It doesn't have the massive ports. It's a wedge engine wearing a Hemi name tag. The modern 6.2-liter Hellcat engine makes 700 horsepower. That's impressive. But here's the thing. It does it with a supercharger. It forces air in with a mechanical pump. The original 426 Hemi did it naturally. It breathed the atmosphere and turned it into violence through pure geometry. It didn't need a blower. It didn't need a turbo. It just needed air, fuel, and a driver brave enough to keep his foot down. The new Hemi is a tribute. The old Hemi was a weapon. And that distinction matters. It's the difference between a replica sword you buy at the mall and the actual steel blade that won a war. This is why collectors are losing their minds over these cars. When a 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible rolls across the auction block and the bidding goes to $3 million, $4 million, people gasp. They say, it's just a car. But it's not. It's a survivor of the homologation wars. It is a physical artifact of the moment when Detroit had more power than the government knew how to regulate. It represents the absolute zenith of American mechanical freedom before the dark ages of emissions equipment strangled the life out of the V8. Buying a Hemi car is like buying a piece of the moon rocket. It's technology that we decided was too much for civilized society. And let's talk about Richard Petty one last time, because without the Hemi, would he be the king? Probably. He was a brilliant driver, but the Hemi gave him the sword he needed to slay the giants. That 1964 season, where he won 9 races and the championship, set the trajectory for his entire career. It established the Petty Enterprise's dominance that would last for decades. The Hemi didn't just make power, it made heroes. It turned a lanky kid from North Carolina into a household name because he was the only one who could tame the elephant. The ban itself, the anti-Chrysler rules of 1965, remains the most controversial decision in NASCAR history. Was it fair? Absolutely not. Was it necessary? Maybe. If Bill France hadn't stepped in, Chrysler might have won every race for 5 years. Ford would have quit. GM would have stayed away. NASCAR might have become a one-manufacturer series, which is a death sentence for motorsport. In a twisted way, by banning the Hemi, Bill France saved the sport. He sacrificed fairness for survival. He chose the show over the science. It's a bitter pill to swallow if you're a Mopar fan, but if you look at the packed grandstands of the 1970s, you have to admit, the dictator was right. But the engineers at Chrysler got the last laugh. They proved that you can't regulate genius. You can add weight, you can restrict carburetors, you can ban bodies, but you cannot uninvent the hemispherical combustion chamber. The principles they proved in 1964, airflow, thermal efficiency, structural rigidity, became the Bible for high-performance engines. Every time you see a modern race engine with canted valves and high-flowing ports, you are looking at the grandchildren of the 426. They might not call it a Hemi, but the DNA is there. So the next time someone tells you that NASCAR is just cars driving in circles, tell them about 1964. Tell them about the year an engine was so good it got arrested. Tell them about the time Ford Motor Company, with all its billions, took their ball and went home because they were scared of a Plymouth. Tell them about the secret math, the acid-dipped bodies, and the boycott that almost killed the sport. Because that isn't just racing history. That is the story of American innovation. We push the boundaries until they break, and then we build something even faster to break them again. The 426 Hemi was never just an engine. It was a statement. It said, we can build it better than you, faster than you, and tougher than you. And for 7 glorious, chaotic years, it was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. It retired undefeated, not because it was beaten, but because it was banned. And in the world of racing, that is the ultimate victory. To be so good that the rule book has to be rewritten to stop you, that is immortality. We've covered the impossible Vega that cheated gravity, and now the unfair Hemi that cheated the rulebook. These are the stories of legacy motoring, the machines that were too fast, too loud, and too dangerous for their own good. If you love this kind of deep dive mechanical storytelling, where we don't just look at the cars but the politics and the engineering behind them, then you're in the right place. We are building a library of the banned and the forgotten. From the smoky Unique Chevelle to the turbine cars of Indy, if it upset the establishment, we are going to talk about it. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and drop a comment below. Tell me, was Bill France right to ban the Hemi to save the show, or should he have let them race and let the best engineer win? I read every comment, and I want to know whose side you're on. Thanks for watching, thanks for respecting the history, and remember, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. But if you're winning so much they ban you, well, then you're a legend. I'll see you in the next one.